Seizing central space immediately, this pawn thrust dictates the early battlefield and prepares for rapid development. Developing a knight to f6 offers flexibility, controlling central squares while keeping options open for pawn structures. Asserting central space, this push immediately creates a dynamic tension, preparing for a flexible development of white's pieces. Opening the door for the king's bishop, this pawn advance firmly establishes black's central presence, preparing for a solid, often positional game. Building a solid central pawn structure and preparing kingside castling are the immediate priorities with this knight development. This move establishes central tension, challenging white's pawn structure and opening lines for black's pieces. Solidifying the center with NC prepares for a rapid development of white's pieces, aiming to control key squares. Preparing to expand on the queenside, this often signals an intent to gain space or prepare a pawn break. By exchanging pawns, white aims to unclog the center and potentially activate the queen's bishop. Reclaiming the pawn with the e-pawn solidifies black's central pawn structure, aiming to contest white's spatial advantage. Developing the bishop here pins the knight, preparing to exploit doubled pawns if black chooses to capture. Solidifying the bishop's position prevents immediate tactical threats and prepares for queen's development to control the center. Solidifying the center now opens lines for development and potential queenside pressure. Solidifying central pawn presence and preparing for potential queenside expansion after that pawn push. Securing the queen centrally prepares for queenside expansion and potential attacks on black's pawn structure. Securing the monarch amidst the emerging pawn chain sets up a more robust defensive setup. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside castling, aiming for harmonious piece development. Reinforcing the d-pawn and preparing for a central pawn break with e5 offers greater flexibility. Securing the king behind a pawn shield, preparing to connect the rooks for future central control and potential action. Bringing the rook to the open file signals an intent to contest central control, potentially targeting white's queenside structure later. Prophylaxis against bishop threats, freeing the king from potential pins and reinforcing the queenside structure. Creating a slight space for the bishop and preparing potential counterplay on the kingside, though it does concede a touch more central dominion. Repositioning the bishop to a more active diagonal opens lines and prepares for potential central breakthroughs. Challenging the center's structure, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's harmonious development and create dynamic imbalances. Unlocking the queenside diagonal offers a clear line for your queen, but invites doubled pawns and potentially weakens your pawn structure. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight immediately reignites central tension, opening lines for piece activation. Opening the central files and preparing to exert pressure along the d-file, white aims for active piece play. Releasing the pawn tension, black hopes to simplify and avoid a cramped position, but white gains central space. Recapturing the pawn on d3 solidifies the center and prepares to exploit the open d-file for future piece activity. Black fortifies the queenside pawn chain, eyeing a future b5 advance for queenside space. Unleashing a knight's potential, this maneuver aims to control crucial central squares and potentially fork pieces. Opening the c-file for a potential pawn storm, black repositions the bishop to a more active square, challenging white's central influence and eyeing the queenside. Unlocking the d-file is now white's primary objective after this exchange. Reclaiming the pawn with the queen reestablishes symmetry, but grants white more central influence. Commanding the open c-file, white marshals forces for a central push, potentially opening lines towards black's castled king. Securing the crucial c-file opens avenues for counterplay along the open lines. Repositioning the rook to this semi-open file solidifies control and prepares for potential pawn advances or piece exchanges on the queenside. Eyeing open files, black activates a queen, aiming to disrupt white's central grip. Reinforcing the c-file initiative consolidates white's central influence and readies for potential pawn advances. Consolidating the rook on the open c-file solidifies black's central presence and prepares for potential pawn advances. Challenging black's queenside dominance, this pawn advance creates immediate tension and probes for weaknesses. Seeking refuge for that queen, or perhaps a repositioning for a central thrust into the d-file vacuum. This maneuver aims to gain control of the important c5 square and prepare a queenside expansion. A knight finds a dynamic outpost, threatening to disrupt white's rook placement and control central squares. Repositioning the queen to this square prepares a potential kingside assault and strengthens the grip on the queenside diagonals. Exploring the c-file's possibilities, black repositions the rook to prepare for potential pressure or defensive maneuvers, potentially creating counterplay. Unleashing a queen that pins down enemy knights, forcing a reaction that clears lines. Exchanging queen simplifies, potentially steering towards a more comfortable rook and pawn endgame for black. This knight capture fundamentally shifts the game's dynamic, opening clear paths for white's remaining pieces and challenging black's central pawn structure. Reclaiming central influence and preparing to contest the d-file is key now. This move aggressively stakes a claim on the 7th rank, threatening to create dangerous passed pawns. Repositioning the rook to the open file intensifies pressure, preparing to contest control or exploit potential pawn weaknesses. Seizing the open file asserts dominion, forcing black into a reactive posture. Reclaiming the central square with the knight offers flexibility, preparing to challenge white's dominant rook. Seizing the open file, white eyes the isolated pawns and aims to exploit black's vulnerable king. Asserting the e4 pawn and seeking respite from the pinned knights is the immediate goal. Seizing the open file, this maneuver forces black to defend immediately, creating dynamic attacking possibilities. Forcing the recapture on the c-file clarifies the pawn structure, creating a more open board for the coming material exchanges. Forcing the rook exchange simplifies the position, aiming to exploit the passed d-pawn and create mating threats against the exposed black king. The monarch cautiously retreats, seeking a safer haven on the 7th rank, away from the immediate crossfire. Initiating a decisive pawn push towards the kingside, aiming to exploit the compromised pawn structure and create weaknesses for the black king. Regaining a central outpost after the exchange simplifies the board and aims for active piece play. Shifting pressure to the queenside, the rook now occupies a vital open file, aiming to dismantle black's pawn structure and secure crucial space. Asserting presence on the open c-file, this bishop aims to disrupt white's rook coordination. Bolstering the central pawn structure now prevents black's knight from finding better squares after a potential f5 push. The bishop retreats, preparing to redeploy to a more active diagonal after white's pawn advances, hoping to disrupt white's kingside pressure. Solidifying the queenside pawns before considering pawn pushes on the kingside offers a more robust defensive structure. Reclaiming the central files is a good idea, though it allows white's rook to penetrate. The monarch inches towards the center, aiming to activate its dormant power and contest the remaining open files. Fianchettoing the knight allows it to participate more actively on the kingside, potentially preparing a future g5 pawn push to challenge white's central control. Asserting kingside space now that the queens have departed, this pawn pushes aggressively forward. This pawn push on the kingside risks weakening black's already compromised defensive structure, potentially creating new targets for white's rooks. Shifting the king to a safer square begins consolidating white's material advantage. Initiating a patient repositioning of the rook, aiming to solidify defensive coverage and prepare for potential pawn advances. The king vacates its comfortable post, a strategic retreat to avoid immediate tactical complications. Initiating a maneuver to reposition the rook, aiming to reinforce the kingside pawn structure against white's potential advances. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, this creates a more stable base for the knight and discourages any immediate pawn advances from black. Consolidating the king's safety is paramount now, seeking a more secure square amidst potential pawn advances. Pushing the a-pawn aggressively claims vital queenside space, aiming to restrict black's knight and prepare further pawn advances. This flank thrust aims to destabilize white's position, potentially opening lines for the black queen or king. Attempting to break open the position before black consolidates, but it weakens white's king and opens critical diagonals. Opening the g-file unleashes chaos, potentially exposing the king to sudden invasions. Reasserting central knight pressure, a subtle yet effective shift in piece placement. Consolidating the black king's position is paramount, seeking safety before the inevitable pawn exchanges. Reinforcing the central knight after black's pawn sacrifice secures more space. Shifting the rook aggressively to the 6th rank pressures white's pawns and opens new avenues for counterplay. Clearing a path for the queen to become active again after forcing the knight back is a key priority. Exploiting the open diagonal, black immediately disrupts white's pawn structure, creating dynamism in a tense middle game. Pawns now create threats along the open file, forcing black to defend his king more actively. Suddenly, black reclaims initiative by menacing white's doubled pawns and disrupting coordination. Seizing the open file to pressure the king's defense, this rook now aims to control the important central column. Snatching the pawn offers immediate material gain, but this sacrifice of tempo opens crucial diagonals for white's aggressive pieces. Seizing the open file with the pawn now opens lines for counterplay. The knight attempts to find a more active outpost, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. The rook aggressively invades, threatening the pawn and disrupting black's defense. Reclaiming material and re-establishing a tactical threat on the kingside, this recapture sets up a more active game. Capturing the pawn clears the way for your rook to dominate the now open b-file and put pressure on black's position. A bold check, aiming to disrupt the white pawn structure and possibly create counterplay. The white king becomes an active piece, seeking safety on the queen side. Swapping pieces here simplifies matters, potentially leading to a more decisive endgame if white can't defend that isolated pawn. Relocating the rook to the queen side attempts to create a blockade, limiting the black knight's mobility and potential for further advancement. A calculated risk to centralize the rook, aiming to disrupt white's kingside advance and create counterplay on the open files. Bringing the king toward the center unlocks its offensive potential. Defending the knight while simultaneously attacking the white king's pawn structure on the kingside. Knight jumps into a central outpost, disrupting the pawn structure and eyeing vulnerable squares. Suddenly opening the kingside after a long period of maneuvering might prove to be a tactical blunder. This knight repositions to a vital outpost, eyeing potential breakthroughs on the queen side and preventing black's king from finding a safe haven. Suddenly igniting a pawn storm, black aims to unleash a kingside breakthrough before white can consolidate. Reclaiming the central knight reestablishes a flexible defense and prepares to contest the open files. Shifting the king further back prepares for any unexpected pawn pushes and supports the knight's eventual advance. Capturing that rook dramatically simplifies the endgame, aiming to exploit the passed pawn while simplifying lines. Seizing the open file, the rook aims to disrupt the enemy king's sanctuary. The knight's sweep to the queenside pawn now forces its immediate surrender, simplifying into a clear material advantage. Snaring the knight with tempo, black aims to disrupt white's newfound pawn dominance and potentially activate the king. King activation begins, seeking central influence after the exchange on a6, aiming to secure the remaining pawns. The king ventures out, seeking activity but exposing itself to the watchful knight. Reclaiming the center with the knight sets up a potential king hunt. The knight's check targets the white king, forcing a response and disrupting white's pawn structure. King activation is paramount now, steering the monarch toward the center to aid the remaining pawns in their decisive push. Seeking shelter from the discovered attack, The monarch finds a temporary reprieve on the 8th rank, though the looming knights pose a significant threat. The white king seeks sanctuary on the queenside, a necessary retreat from the immediate threats. Seeking a surprising outpost for the knight, hoping to disrupt white's control of the queenside. The pawn races forward, seeking promotion and asserting its newfound dominance on the queenside flank. Unleashing the passed pawn's potential is the sole objective now, aiming to disrupt the opponent's coordination. Opening the diagonal for the queen's attack, this knight fork forces the opposition and is a brilliant tactical thrust. King's perilous journey continues. Black must finally prioritize safety and consolidate pieces. Unleashing the knight to threaten the isolated pawn and potentially force a simplification that benefits white's material advantage. A desperate attempt to disrupt the invading knight and gain a tempo for defense. King scurries for safety, seeking sanctuary on the 8th rank before the impending pawn storm. Unleashing the knight to patrol the critical c8 square, eyeing potential outpost gains in this tense endgame. Unlocking the knight's potential offers a fresh attacking avenue along the king's flank.